The biggest fear in human life is the fear of death. But for those who believe in the transmigration of the soul, death is only a transition to the next life. It seemed that just yesterday Brian was a healthy 34-year-old man full of energy, a successful marketing specialist who ran marathons and was an eligible bachelor. And now he turned out to be terminally ill. For the past 6 months, the intensive care unit had become his second home. The young man in the prime of his life was suffering with acute heart failure. He was lying in the hospital bed entangled in the wires of numerous life-sustaining devices, tormented by expectations of the unknown. More than anything, he simply wanted it all to be finally over, regardless of how it would end. He just couldn't take it anymore. He spent his days and nights without sleep, listening to the buzzing of the machines that kept him alive, only managing to take short naps after getting sedatives. But why did this happen to him? The doctors had no answer. Brian was sick of trying to figure it out, so he tried not to think about anything anymore. He just laid in bed waiting for it all to end. And it did, but not how the man expected it to. One day, as the new on-call team arrived at the ICU, the on-call surgeon burst into the department with the words, "Quickly, get the patient ready for surgery. We have a heart." The shocking news made Brian dizzy, although in his condition it was a fairly common occurrence. But this time, feelings of joy and hope were added into the mix. On the other hand, the man felt very ashamed of his reaction because the phrase, "we have a heart," meant only one thing. Some person was dying right at that moment or had just died. And it must have been a very good person since he was an organ donor, and that's not a thing just anyone could do. However, Brian couldn't help himself. He lay there smiling because now he had a chance. Then came the long surgery and a month-long physical therapy course at the hospital. Finally, the day came when Brian got discharged. The doctors gave him a bunch of prescriptions and instructed him to come back every week for a checkup. Brian left in a dreary mood, because he still couldn't believe that he'd be able to go back to living a normal life. Moreover, there was a piece of paper with an address in his pocket. "I definitely need to visit the parents of the young biker who died so ridiculously under the wheels of a truck in order to give me his heart," Brian kept thinking. It took the man several days to muster up the courage for a visit to the donor's relatives. The more Brian thought about the upcoming visit, the more upset and worried he got. The man had no idea what he would say to the people who had lost their only child, because back at the hospital, Brian learned that the biker's parents were shocked by their son's decision to become an organ donor. They simply didn't know anything about it. There was no point in waiting any longer. Therefore, Brian pulled himself together and drove his car to the remote neighborhood of the city where the donor's parents lived. On his way over, the man tried to find the right words that would sound sincere, but there was no need for it, just as there was no need to explain who he was. Seeing the downcast stranger at her door, the donor's mother started sobbing and buried herself in his chest, and then, having asked for permission, listened for a long time to her son's heart beating in someone else's chest. The father didn't even shake Brian's hand. He was clearly depressed. The man stood at a distance, looking intently at something in the far corner. Only after looking closely did Brian realize that the face of the gray-haired man was wet with tears. Without saying a word, Brian ran out into the yard and then kept running aimlessly, panting heavily. He lit a cigarette, despite knowing that he wasn't allowed to smoke. Then he froze. Someone else's heart was pounding in his chest. He felt that he needed to do something very important, that if he didn't do it, his life would lose all meaning. It took all the strength he had to pull himself together and go home. But the next morning, he felt the need to come back again. Brian was drawn there, against his own will, by some disturbing and very strong feeling. This time, he didn't go to see the donor's parents, but simply stood in the yard, looking around in surprise. What am I supposed to do? This question tormented the man more and more with each passing day. But even worse yet, his heart started failing at night. The medical examination didn't reveal any issues. The heart was fine at the hospital. There wasn't even an arrhythmia, but as soon as Brian returned home, the heart started acting out again. God, I would rather have died with my own heart than suffer with someone else's, the man thought, exhausted on his way to the donor's house yet again. Brian decided that it would be the last time he went there, no matter what his heart demanded. It was just an internal organ, a muscle that didn't have the right to ruin his life. Therefore, upon arriving at the place, Brian simply stopped at the gate, stood there for a minute with his eyes closed, completely surrendering to the inner rhythm. Then he started slowly turning clockwise, hoping that someone else's heart beating inside his chest would give him a hint. And it did. It beat quietly and tremulously. Opening his eyes, Brian slowly wandered into the far corner of the yard, making his way through the clutter. He carefully looked around because something very important was nearby. The quiet beating of the donor's heart warned him about it. The man took 2 more steps and almost stumbled over a drooping old dog. The animal sat there sadly looking down, without even looking at Brian. The dog bared its teeth angrily, unambiguously suggesting that the stranger should leave. Brian was about to follow its advice, but his heart suddenly began to beat faster. The man took a deep breath and extended his hand to the poor fellow. The dog rushed in surprise at the guest's feet and started whining plaintively as if it recognized him. Then it dawned on Brian. This was his donor's dog. That was what his heart wanted. Well, come with me. He patted the shaggy animal on the head. I won't just leave you here. The man breathed a sigh of relief because he wanted a dog ever since he was little, but for some reason he never got one until now. His name is Ollie, came a voice from behind. He misses his master. We miss him too. The father of the late man wiped a tear and continued the conversation. We can't come to terms with the death of our son. He was our only child. He was kind and sweet. He studied dentistry and managed to make a successful career. A couple of years ago, he brought home a stray puppy. He found it near the garage cans and couldn't leave it there. Someone must have thrown it away. There are many bad people around. So Ollie stayed with us. Ethan took care of it, he fed it, and loved it with all his heart, and the dog loved him back. Ollie only accepted food offered by our son. Ever since Ethan passed away, the dog hasn't really been eating, only drinking water. Look how skinny it's become. I don't even know what to say, Brian said, confused. I'm very sorry that your son died. Now the heart of your late son is beating in my chest. He gave me a second life, but I can't be happy about it. But this isn't your fault. You get that, right? The gray-haired man interrupted. Ethan was a risk taker, no matter how much his mother and I tried to get him to calm down. His passion for high speed is what killed him. Returning home from work on his bike, he lost control of it and crashed into a truck. It was only at the hospital that we learned that Ethan was an organ donor. He made that decision when he was still alive and in his right mind. He must have felt something. We will be happy to get to know you because I saw a smile on my wife's face for the first time since Ethan's death when you came to visit us. I'm sure that you are a good person because fate rewards only those who deserve to be happy. And Ollie immediately took a liking to you. Apparently a dog's instinct never fails. The poor fellow. It couldn't believe that its owner was no longer alive. Ollie sat at his grave for hours whining. Let's go inside. It's going to rain soon. I'll make some tea and we can talk. I'm sure my wife will be happy to see you. Brian breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed that he finally got the answer to the most important question that had haunted him since the surgery. Life works in mysterious ways. He was once left without parents, and now he found a new family, and at least for a moment gave the grief-stricken parents the feeling of their son's presence. Time passed, and Brian came to visit late Ethan's family more and more often. He stopped by almost every week after work. He often brought gifts, helped with the housework, and walked the dog. He felt at home with Ethan's family. Seeing the hopeful eyes of the people who had become dear to him, he became more and more convinced that his new heart showed him the right path.